For well over a decade, there has been a popular discussion around the rise and fall of Final Fantasy, an argument that is naturally predicated on the idea that each game has operated on a consistent upward trajectory, levelled off, and thereafter declined. Paradoxically, there is also a popular idea, that is often reflected in rankings of Final Fantasy games, that 1988's Final Fantasy II was an all-time low point for the fledgling series, despite a strong start with the first game in 1987. Turning today to Final Fantasy II, we can certainly argue that it has suffered the slings and arrows of modern sentiment and revisionist criticism. So in this episode, as with my discussion of Final Fantasy I, I want to look back at Final Fantasy II at the particular point in time it was released, look back at it in the context of the wider oeuvre of Final Fantasy, and review it with historical context and the passage of time in mind. Now, what is immediately apparent with Final Fantasy II is that despite the mere year since its predecessor's release, it took furtive steps to depart from and evolve the characteristics of the series, and really embark on a strategy that has underpinned the series ever since, which is to be consistently inconsistent, to experiment and to push the possibilities of what's available in the arenas of storytelling, gameplay and design. And while it's common to see players denounce the trajectory of the series in recent years, or denounce the characteristics of specific entries in the series, whether it's Final Fantasy VIII and the Junction system, Final Fantasy XIII's linearity, or Final Fantasy XVI's action gameplay, we should appreciate that Square has always, to some degree or another, reinvented the wheel with their Final Fantasy games, even as far back as this second instalment in 1988. Indeed, while Square was busy following up on Final Fantasy's success, so too were competitors at the time beginning to serialise their games, with Dragon Quest III and Phantasy Star II being released within a year of Final Fantasy II. But where these rival titles had found their groove and decided in large part to play it safe by not overhauling mechanics, and indeed keep within a set canonical story as sequels to their preceding games, Hironobu Sakaguchi opted to reinvent Final Fantasy II from the ground up as an entirely new story in a new world and a new setting, which became a cornerstone of Final Fantasy for over a decade until the release of Final Fantasy X-2 in 2003. So, looking at the innovations and the experiments that Final Fantasy II embarked upon, some succeeded more than others, and some were blueprints for more maturing mechanics that would come later on down the line. And for example, one of the most criticised aspects of the game is the activity-based progression, which, rather than the traditional experience points-based levelling that's often found in JRPGs, it was instead based on how much a given ability or action was used. And this is something that is still utilised today. For example, in Elder Scrolls games, if you use a single-handed sword a lot, your one-handed ability will go up, or if you sneak a lot, your sneak ability or alchemy or whatever will increase as you do these activities and perform these actions. And even as recently as Final Fantasy VII Remake and Rebirth, you can master a weapon's unique ability by periodically using that ability in battle. But in Final Fantasy II, this rudimentary mechanic was quickly gamed, and while it is still a grindy sort of game, as much as Final Fantasy I and Final Fantasy III were, players quickly found that you could level health, for example, by attacking your own party members, and things like that, to increase and ease the progression with this ability-based style of levelling. Other elements Final Fantasy II introduced were firstly a renewed focus on storytelling, which came through in a couple of ways, which I'll touch on, and a key product of that was more passive instances of dialogue exchanges for the player to observe and click through as characters interrelated and began to develop as the story unfolds. And it's prudent to note at this point that while Final Fantasy was inspired by Western RPGs such as Ultima, as we covered in my Final Fantasy I discussion, we should also acknowledge that JRPGs equally evolved out of a uniquely Japanese genre and Japanese style of game, which was the visual novel genre. And these were largely passive game experiences that offered small pockets of decision making for the player, not unlike a choose-your-adventure gamebook like Fighting Fantasy. And this influence shines through in Final Fantasy II's key terms system, which is a rudimentary form of branching dialogue and something that I think really showed the ambition of Sakaguchi's team and this desire to inject player agency and player decision making into these otherwise passive dialogue exchanges and dialogue scenarios. Now, being a rudimentary system, it was far from perfect, and particularly once you get 7 to 8 plus keywords in your dialogue options, the UI becomes quite unwieldy to scroll through, but nonetheless it gave the opportunity for the player to more dynamically interact with NPCs and progress the plot. And by the standards of 1988 to 1989, it really offered something unique in video game storytelling, I think. In keeping with storytelling, Final Fantasy II also departs from its 1987 predecessor by developing protagonists with identities that could be clearly distinguished beyond the generic Dungeons & Dragons inspired classes that comprised Final Fantasy I's Warriors of Light. In Final Fantasy II, our characters are furnished with names, histories, personalities, and intentions that chart the course of this adventure. And while its successor, Final Fantasy III, would briefly return to the conventions of the 4 generic Light Warriors, it can be appreciated retrospectively that Final Fantasy II was the shape of things to come, with these characters with unique identities contending the obstacles and antagonists of the game world while navigating their own personal dilemmas. Indeed, the primordial beginnings of 3-dimensional, fully realised heroes can reasonably be considered to be the lasting impact of Final Fantasy II, and Firion, Maria, Guy, and Leon laid the foundations for the denser, character-driven stories that would put Squaresoft on the map in the late 1990s. And while the numerical Final Fantasy games are famous for being unique worlds unto themselves, spared the shackles of continuity and sequel making, it is fair to say that there is a discernible formula at work within the games which serves as a successful blueprint for central character arcs. And it's a blueprint that indeed dates back to Homer's Odyssey and beyond into the ages of oral tradition and myth, that was crystallised by concepts such as Joseph Campbell's Hero's Journey, which is a simplistic but convenient framework for exploring the structure of fantasy narratives, all the way from Star Wars through to Lord of the Rings, Harry Potter, and indeed Final Fantasy. And insofar as Final Fantasy II is concerned, it is the start point of Firion, our displaced hero, that is the enduring formula through which the series' protagonists usually begin their personal plights and their contention with the forces of evil. So whether it's Cloud Strife's beginnings as an ex-soldier fighting for Avalanche, Tidus's fall into Spira, Noctis's pilgrimage from Lucis, most, if not all, Final Fantasy games offer a swift departure from the hero's known world, and just as often an absent father figure, which is the hallmark of myths and legends since time immemorial. As such, while Final Fantasy II is by no means a sprawling, character-driven feat such as Final Fantasy VII and others, it was certainly a concerted effort to acknowledge and follow the conventions of successful fantasy storytelling, offering a protagonist whose goodwill is tempered and tested by vendetta, tragedy, and a little more complexity when it comes to figuring out his place in the world. Turning to the Fellowship quest aspect of Final Fantasy II, unlike later Final Fantasy games, which built up the party gradually through acquisition and progression of a motley band, Final Fantasy II furnishes us with the central cast from the very beginning, each of them being known to one another. This naturally reduces the scope for inter-character development and personal subplots and arcs, such as we see in various games and various hometown visitations, for example, such as Final Fantasy VII's arrival at Cosmo Canyon, Corel and Wutai to develop the personal plights of Red 13, Barret and Yuffie, respectively. But while character development was limited in scope, engagement and gameplay was buoyed up by the appearance of guest characters such as Minwu, Joseph and Gordon, who layered each scenario of the story with novelty and distinct elements of narrative progression. The utilisation of guest characters also established the precedent for future Final Fantasy games such as FF16, wherein temporary party members became an increasing occurrence to develop personal arcs or reflect something back onto the hero themselves, such as Clive's interactions with Jill and Cid in that particular game. Now, while Final Fantasy II's story is in principle pretty basic, it's the straightforward good versus evil, evil empire versus rebel alliance sort of thing, I think the ambition towards narrative depth can be glimpsed here, particularly in characters like Leon, who disappears from the party pretty early on and is revealed towards the end to be a muddled antagonist or anti-villain towards the end of the game. Although it plays out in quite a rudimentary fashion, I think the arc of Leon represents the pursuit of depth and complexity in character arcs, and he falls into this, what I like to term, grey character territory, which is seen recurringly throughout the series in characters like Cypher Almasy from FF8, Vossler from Final Fantasy XII, and so on. And it's important to note here because, as I mentioned in my Final Fantasy I discussion, this is an era where many game stories are still operating in this hero saves princess, hero rescues kidnapped girlfriend sort of territory. And so pursuing this level of conflicted character, and particularly finishing up this character arc and story with an inconclusive and sort of ambiguous ending where Leon vanishes off into shame and obscurity, it was a pretty bold manoeuvre by Sakaguchi and Terada to write the character this way. And it really showed, I think, how they were pushing the envelope in how to develop characters and these scenarios in Final Fantasy. Within the framework of this imperialism versus freedom fighters story, and despite the whimsical pseudo-medieval brand of fantasy that Final Fantasy II employs, it abandoned all romantic notions of war and conquest within its setting, and rather than chivalric knights, pitched battles, or notions of honour that is essential to myths and legends of both Japanese and European heritage, Final Fantasy utilises the hand of imperialism upon the world as a very desperate and bleak thing, closer perhaps to reality than any Disney-esque fairy tales. The flight of our characters from the ruins of Fynn at the beginning of the game sets this tone for the pursuant Hellspawn, and throughout the party's journey in Final Fantasy II, we venture through these various towns and locations where the fruits of conquest and occupation is seen, with these damaged, frightened civilians, repressed villages, and even upon acting with the occupying forces of the guards, it prompts battles to take place, showing that the threat is everywhere. The horrors of war and its expense to human life and the natural world is something that the Final Fantasy games would return to, perhaps most poignantly in Final Fantasy Tactics and Final Fantasy VI, in which the entirety of these games shows our heroes being pursued by maniacal forces such as Kefka and the Imperial Army. The fact that Final Fantasy does not shy from the bleakness of imperialism is yet another aspect that was established in Final Fantasy II that makes it unique among its peers across both Western and Japanese role-playing games. And while the dramatic Aerith scene in Final Fantasy VII is one of the more memorable, if not immortalised moments in gaming history, the trail of the dead heroes that inches back into the chronology of the series, all the way back to Final Fantasy II, where we see Minwu, Joseph, and various guest party members sacrificing themselves for a greater cause against a vindictive empire. So, to wrap up, if Final Fantasy I was an innovative first step in exploration and gameplay within the fledgling subgenre of the JRPG, then Final Fantasy II was an innovative first step in story. It was the blueprint for the eclectic, character-driven titles that would follow in the years to come, and it is not unreasonable to suggest that without the success of characters like Firion, the Orphan Warrior, or the Ruthless Emperor of Palamecia, there would be no Cloud Strife, there would be no Kefka. Without Leon as this Darth Vader-esque Dark Knight, there would be no Cypher Almasy, or Kuja, or Vossler. So while Final Fantasy II continues its legacy as one of the less reputable Final Fantasy games, it would be disingenuous to say that it only brought flawed gameplay, excessive grinding, and shoddy levelling systems to bear on the player. It was the first furtive step towards intelligent, complex storytelling, and where its peers still dealt in the generic protagonist classes, such as the generic hero of Dragon Quest, and refused to stray more ambitiously into different gameplay formulas, Final Fantasy II was actively seeking to push and experiment with the limits of story and gameplay, and it stands as a testament to the consistent inconsistency that defines Final Fantasy to this day.